All right. Well, if you've been with us on Wednesday nights, you know we're studying through the book of 1 Corinthians. We find ourselves in chapter 7 tonight, if you want to find your place there. So, in chapter 7, Paul is addressing a concern or a question that the Corinthian church had written Paul. The Corinthians had written Paul a letter, and so part of the reason that Paul is writing 1 Corinthians is in response to their letter to him. And in that letter, apparently they ask, a series of questions that they want his advice, his opinion on. And so one of the questions that they ask in this letter is it good to get married, or would it be better not to get married? And so in the first part of chapter 7, what we looked at last time, Paul addresses this. And he basically says, all other things being equal, it's good if you can remain single. However, it is better to get married than to burn with passion. So if you have the gift from God to where you can be single and not like pine away to be married, then stay single. The reason being is it frees you up to serve God better. You don't have the encumbrances of taking care of a spouse or family and the obligations that come with those things. Not that those things are bad or sinful, it just you don't have as much free time as a married person with a family that you do as a single person. So if you can remain single and it not bother you, then remain single. That's good. But basically, he lays out sort of the rule of thumb, which is be content with whatever state the Lord has you in. If you're married, then be content being married, and don't wish you were single, and enjoy the blessings of marriage that God has given you. If you're single, be content with that, and don't pine your life away wishing that you were in a situation that you're not. But be content with whatever situation that you're in. And you could even apply this to all that he talks about, slaves and masters. He talks about, you could say your job, whatever job God has you doing, be content doing it. And if Paul would say, if you have an opportunity to better yourself, good, go for it. That's a blessing from God. But don't sit and pine your life away wishing that you were in some situation that you weren't. Now, when we get to verse 25, where we're going to pick up tonight, he's still talking about the same thing. He's still basically answering the same question of should I get married or not, but he's now going to sort of go into finer detail on a couple of groups of unmarried people. So he's going to talk first about, he says virgins, we would say, those that never been married, which you would hope if you've never been married that you were a virgin. But anyway, that's the idea that he's making there, is that those never married, and then widows. What about the widows? What about somebody that was married and they lose their spouse? What then? And so that's what he's going to talk about tonight. So, any questions on what we talked about last time before we get in? Because this is just going to kind of further muddy the water. Okay, let's look at verse 25 then of chapter 7. Now, concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord. In other words, what he means there is the Lord Jesus didn't specifically speak to this, but Paul's going to speak to it. And so it becomes authoritative to us because he's writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So he says, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. In other words, he's saying there's not a direct command of Jesus about this particular subject that you're asking me about, but he said, you can believe me because I know what I'm talking about. So that's Paul's words. Verse 26, I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even though those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. And boy, Paul says a whole lot when he makes that statement right there. So Paul makes a couple of really interesting statements in this little thing where he's talking about, is it good to get married or not? And one of the things he says that those who have wives should live as though they had none. Now, what does he mean? Like, yeah, focus on Jesus. He doesn't mean, go ahead and head to the sports bar on Friday night with your buddies as though you didn't have a wife. That's not what he's saying, right? He's saying, don't view relationships in this world as though they're ultimate or the permanent state of things. In other words, the things of this world are passing away. The form of this world is passing away. So human relationships are not ultimate. What is ultimate in life as a believer? What should be ultimate in my life? Jesus Christ. That is ultimate. He is not a means to an end. He is the end. I preached a sermon on that a couple of weeks ago. So you can't view the things of this world, even the relationships of this world, as something that is ultimate. So you can't get caught up in that. For instance, Lisa and I have been married 28 years. Just celebrated our 28th anniversary. In a lot of ways, it seems like it was just a few days. I mean, just a couple of days ago that we were walking down the aisle. That was 28 years ago. In some ways, and in some ways it seems like we were always together, but 28 years, now think about that. I'm 56, 5. I don't want to make myself older than I am, 55. 28 years from now, I'll be 83. My daddy died when I was 82. There's a good chance I'll never see 28 more years with Lisa. And if those 28 went by as quick as these 28, then, man, it won't be but just a couple of days and I'll be gone. Now, here's the thing. Here's what people don't understand. They don't grasp it because they don't want to grasp it. Like, the form of this world is passing away. Like, Jesus has already said, in heaven there's no marriage, there's no giving in marriage. Like we love each other. People say, well, you know everybody in heaven. Will I know my spouse in heaven? Will I know mama in heaven? Yes, I believe that you will. But here's the thing. You won't love your spouse in heaven any more than you love anybody else. Will mama know me in heaven? Sure she will. But she won't love you any more than she does anybody else. Oh, but my mom will always love. She will love you with a perfect love. But we will love everyone with a perfect love. It's hard to get our mind around that. I'll preach funeral or whatever, and somebody will tell me, and I don't ever, a funeral is not the time to try to correct people's theology. I found that out. You just hug them and cry with them. there's a time to straighten out theology. This is the time, by the way, to straighten out theology. But funeral's not a good time. But they'll say, it was so hard to see Mama go. But I know now that Mama and Daddy are dancing in heaven. And I just say, yep. But in the back of my mind, I go, how do you know that Mama ain't dancing with some Chinese man that she never met on earth before? How do you know that Daddy ain't playing checkers with that Chinese man? And that's a game that lasts for all eternity because nobody loses in heaven, right? The form of this world is passing away. I mean, Lisa and I have had this conversation. I can't imagine not being like it being different. But I know in my head, I know it will be. And I've already said, I don't think they allow kissing in heaven. Pretty sure they don't. But when I get to heaven, will you hold my hand and can we have a picnic together, maybe by the Crystal River or something? And she said she would. But I know good and well, by the time she gets, when she gets to heaven, I'm going to have to wait 1,000 years because she's probably going to have, she's going to spend the first 1,000 years with Jesus. I know that. And then, she's, Apostle Paul, and she's got a list she's going to work through. And that's okay. I'm good with that. I'm speaking a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but you understand what I'm saying, that we think in terms of this finite earth being the way things are going to be forever, and they're just not. And if we can keep that in mind, then whatever state I'm in, married, single, with kids, without kids, I've seen people obsess over not being able to have kids. It just drives them crazy. Yeah, kids are a blessing, but it's not you only get kids for a little while anyway. Mine are already grown and gone, and well, part of them are gone. Part of them still eating my groceries, but that time when they're little kids, it lasts such a short time. So anyway, that's what Paul is talking about there. And he says, I reckon in this present distress, it's good for a man to remain as he is. In other words, be content with whatever situation you're in because of this present distress. Now, what does he mean when he says present distress? Yeah, so there's a lot of debate on what Paul meant, and there's a couple of different ways you can interpret it. Some interpreters take it to mean some sort of local catastrophe or calamity, be it persecution in the church, which really at this point Corinth wasn't experiencing a whole lot of that. Famine or some localized calamity is one way to take it. Or the other is the suffering and persecution that comes with being associated with Christ. And I don't know exactly what Paul meant, maybe a little bit of both, but I definitely think that the idea of the suffering and persecution that as a believer you're going to face in this world has something to do with that. Look, you really don't have time to be worried about, am I married? Am I not married? Am I going to find the love of my life, or am I not? Am I going to, find that dream job, or am I not? Because it's all going away in just a little bit. Just a very short time, it's all going away. So don't waste your time worrying about that stuff. Instead, focus on the Lord. That's the idea there. And in verse 20, if you look at verse 29, he says, I will say this, brethren, the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should be as they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. In other words, if you're sad for the things of the world, don't be sad. It's going away pretty soon. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. If you're enjoying life in the world, don't rejoice too much because it'll be over with before you know it. Those who buy as though they did not possess, here's the thing. No matter what you can amass and how many trophies you set on the shelf, in just a few years, it's all gone. You don't get to carry any of it with you. And we all start over from scratch. And what you get to carry with you are not the possessions and the trophies that you amass in this life. What you get to carry with you is what you do for Jesus, with Jesus, and what he does in and through you. So that's the idea there. He says, I want you to be without care. I'm in 32. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who, let's see, I think I skipped too far ahead. Those who use the world, for the form of this world is passing away. So in these verses, Paul advises rather a change of state. Rather than a change of state, believers need a change of attitude. So rather than being focused on changing my state, I'm single and I want to be married. I'm married, but I wish I was single. I have this job, but I wish I had that job. I'm at this school, but I want to go to that school. He's saying, rather than be so preoccupied with changing your state of life, change your attitude to say, okay, none of this stuff really matters in the grand scheme of things. What matters is my relationship to Christ. That is ultimate. And all these other relationships, all of these other things, they're just subsequent to that. And Paul says, I'm not saying this to put, to put burdens on you, just to tell you, you can't get married, or you have to get married, or any of that stuff. He said, I want you to be free. He said, I'm just saying what would be best for you. And remember, he said, not everybody has this gift. Not everybody can be single and be okay with that. So he said, I'm just saying that if you can, you're probably better off. But don't obsess over it, whatever it may be. Questions or comments on those verses? All right, let's look on to verse 32 then. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There's a difference between a wife and a virgin. In other words, there's a difference between a woman who's married and a woman who's not married. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. So he's saying, I'm not telling you this to try to burden you, or in his term, put a leash on you and tell you, you have to do this or you can't do that. He's saying, I'm interested in what's best for you. And he says, when you're married, you have to take care of the concerns of your family. That's not to say that someone who's married doesn't love the Lord and can't serve the Lord. That's not what he's saying. Nor is he saying just by being single that you necessarily are more holy or closer to God. What he's saying is that the less entanglements of this world, including relationships in this world, that you are bound to, the freer you are to serve the Lord. Let me give you an example. When I was in seminary, so God called me to preach. I was 23 years old when I surrendered to the ministry. I started the seminary like that next fall. So I was 23, not quite 24. I was single. No steady girlfriend, no fiancé, no wives, no nothing. No phone, no light, no motor car. That's how I started. I did have a car, but anyway. But I watched, and it was hard. Was it? I mean, I worked during the day. I went to school at night. I mean, it was tough. It was hard. I studied on the weekends and preached on Sundays, and I mean, it was hard. But I watched these guys, and they would roll in every fall. And they would have, that's back in the day when the station wagon was a thing, you know. And they would roll in with a station wagon with a wife and about 6 kids loaded in the back of it, playpens strapped to the, you know, and everything. And I thought, man, you know, that's hard. They're doing what they can. They're following the call of God. God called them, and evidently He called them when they were married. And they're trying the best they can to follow the call of God. But here's the thing. They've got to go to school, but they've got to go out and get a full-time job. I worked part-time because I didn't have to have a full-time salary. I was happy eating Taco Bell and $1.99 chicken meals from Church's Chicken. I didn't have to worry about feeding a wife and kids. I was happy with a pizza box being my coffee table. You know, I mean, I didn't need a lot. And so I was free to take a part-time job and go to school and study. And I graduated, and 2 weeks later, we got married. 2 weeks after that, I was pastor of my first church. Now, that was a gift from God to me. Now, I didn't see it. Did I see it that way? I thought I was cursed. Oh, God, what's wrong with me? Why can't I have a wife? But looking back, I see God gave me a gift that I didn't have to worry about supporting a wife and kids. All I had to worry about was following the call of God. And all I had to worry about supporting was me, and I'm cheap. So, you know, in seminary, they give the wives this little degree, mock degree. It's a PhD, putting hubby through. And the idea is that, you know, the wife worked full time to put the husband through school. I'm glad I didn't have a wife that had to do that. I mean, if we were married, would Lisa have done that? I have no doubt she would. She's that kind of person. But I'm glad she didn't have to. You know, I told my boys, I gave them one piece of advice. And I told them, I said, you do what you want to. If you want to get married at 18, I'm going to love you, and I'm going to love your wife and whatever kids you have. I'm going to love them. But if I can give you one piece of advice as a father to a son, is get your schooling out of the way first. Then get married. Whatever you want. If you're going to stop after a bachelor's degree, if you're going to go on to graduate school, whatever, you and the Lord get worked out. But get your schooling out of the way first. And they've just about done that. So now I'm like, okay, can I give you some more advice? I want some grandkids now. No. But anyway, that's the idea there that Paul is trying to make. He says there's nothing wrong with getting married, but sometimes being single in a certain time in your life is a gift. So how could we sum up Paul's advice to Christians concerning their life situation? I think we'd say remain as you are. That's what Paul is saying. Be content with where God has you at the time. Don't always be looking for something else. If God has a change in your life to bring about, then He'll do that. But don't always be. Now, you know, have I always followed that piece of advice? No, and that's why I've been miserable a good part of the early part of my life. But what Paul says makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So Paul is addressing marriage not in terms of sin, but in terms of what's best for them. He said, if you want to get married, get married. It's not a sin to get married, but I'm talking in terms of what's best for you. So, and I think that's a good way to look at it. I think so many times we want to look at something and say, well, is this a sin or is it not? But sometimes something that isn't necessarily a sin also isn't necessarily the best option. So Paul's trying to get us to think not in terms of what's a sin, but what's best for me. And that's the idea there. So according to Paul, neither singleness nor marriage is the answer, but complete devotion to Christ regardless of the life situation you're in. So it's not, oh, should I be single? Oh, should I be married? But wherever you are, single, married, whatever, then complete devotion to God. That seems to be the answer in whatever situation you're in. Questions on those verses? the last blank is, according to Paul, neither singleness nor marriage is the answer, but complete devotion to Christ, regardless of the life situation that you're in. So it wasn't a sin per se, but it was viewed, and you bring up a good point, because Paul is really speaking in radical terms here, because in ancient Jewish thinking, for a woman to not get married and not have kids was considered a shameful, almost like being cursed from God. That's why it was such a big deal to a woman who couldn't have kids. You read about, like Hannah or Rachel or some of the ladies in the New Testament who struggled conceiving, and it was such a big deal. And we read it and go, well, yeah, I understand you want kids, but I don't see what the big deal. We don't see what the big deal is, because in our culture, if a woman has kids or not has kids, it really doesn't affect society's view of them. But in those days, it really did. So it wasn't a sin not to get married. I mean, that wasn't the idea, but it was one of those deals where you were expected to. A man and engagements were usually arranged. And so a man would go to the father of a girl, and he would work out arrangements that whenever your daughter gets marrying age, then your daughter and my son will get married, and you work all that. It was arranged. Marriages were arranged for the most part in those. This whole idea of marrying for love, that's really more of a Western, 20th century Western thought. It really wasn't the Jewish thought, for sure. So I don't know if I answered your question, but anyway, I hit all around it anyway, maybe. All right, let's look at verse 36 here. Now we get into some really fun stuff to try to weed through here. If any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God. So Paul said, this is my opinion, but since I'm speaking by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, it's true. That's basically what he's saying there. Now, so basically, again, like we said before, Paul is kind of restating what he said before, and that is marital status cannot be ultimate. Nor can parenthood be ultimate, nor can any earthly life situation be the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is my relationship with Christ. Everything else is subsequent to that. Now, we got to try to unpackage verse 36, because Paul, he uses odd terminology, and it doesn't translate well into English at all. If any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do whatever he wishes, or let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Anybody want to take a stab at what Paul means by that? Possibly. So there is a couple of different ways of interpreting it. People have interpreted it. Some have taken it to be a man and his daughter. And so the idea there would be if your daughter reaches marrying age and she wants to get married and you want to keep her single because you think that's what's best for her, or maybe that's what's best for you if she somehow helps you around the house or whatever. But she really wants to get married, and you feel as though that really by forcing her to be single, I'm really somehow being unfair to her. Then let her get married. Give her away. And the idea is that the dad would give her away. Again, it's arranged marriages. So find her a husband, basically. If you haven't sinned, but if not, then you do well. Now, so that's one possible interpretation. What's another? I mean, it has been thrown out that somehow the father might have impure thoughts for the daughter. I think that's really stretching the text beyond what Paul is saying here. I think in some way, however it shakes down, whether it's the father of the daughter or whether it's the fiance of the girl, that somehow or another you're dealing with an engaged couple here, because remember, engagements took place early on, like they were arranged. And so if you're the father of a girl, like early on, like you don't wait till the girl is 21 and then say, oh, well, let's find her a husband. I mean, early on, like when she's still a kid, you find a match for her, and it's an arranged marriage. And so there's an engagement process, and that couple is engaged, and they are, basically engaged in every way other than physical relations, even to the point that it would require a divorce to separate. That's why when Joseph and Mary, when Mary is found with child, Joseph wants to put her away privately because they're engaged. Because he thinks before the angel talks to him, he thinks that Mary's been stepping out on him, and so they were if they were engaged, and they get to an age where their passions burn for one another. Like, look, I'm engaged to this woman, and I want to have physical relations with this woman, then let them marry. That's what he's saying. Let them get married. But if you can remain single, then you spare yourself from a lot of the cares of this world that come with being married and having a family and all of those things. So I don't know how well we explain that, but questions on that? That's about as good as I can get at it anyway. But I do think it has to do with an engaged couple. If they can remain single and celibate, great, all the better. If not, then get married. I have to say, once you say, let's get married, like it becomes exponentially more difficult to remain pure. And I advise young couples when they come to me and they get married, and I've made countless parents angry at me, and if your kids come to me wanting me to do marriage counseling, I'll probably make you mad at me too. But I tell them, don't have no long engagement. Like, plan an engagement long enough to be able to plan a wedding and then get married. Because I've had couples come, oh, we're engaged, but we're gonna wait 5 years to get married. I'm like, no, you ain't. Like you're either going to move up, and I've seen that done a lot too. We moved it up to 2 years. Well, we moved it up to 6 months. Hey, Brother Mark, we want to get married next month. Can you do the wedding? You're putting yourself in a dangerous situation when you say, well, we're going to get married, but it's a long way off. Don't do that. Like, either get married or don't get married, but if you're going to get married, then don't put it off indefinitely like that. You're inviting sexual temptation to come your way. So I think that's kind of what Paul is talking about here, is that, look, if you're engaged and you know that, hey, we're supposed to be getting married, but, we keep putting it off because we have this idea that, well, singleness is better. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Like, if you can be single and not pine away for one another, okay, great. But if not, then it's better to get married, is the idea there. And then he gives instructions to the widows in verse 39. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she's at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So basically, that he's saying that if you're married, then you are commanded to stay with that person till death do you part. Now, at the point at which one or the other of you dies, or, men, you one day you don't wake up because there's a tent peg driven through your skull, or what, just hypothetically, if that were to happen, then you're free to remarry. The widow or widower is free to remarry whoever they want to, but the one stipulation is in the Lord. In other words, they need to be a believer. Like, we are commanded not to marry an unbeliever. And I don't know why you would want to anyway. I never understood why a believer would want to marry an unbeliever, but we are commanded not to do that, whether you want to or not. But he says the widow is happier, according to him, in his opinion, if she remains single. But if she can't control herself, or he can't control himself, and passions burn, get married. It's not a sin. You're free. So you're free to remarry a Christian, but if you choose not to remarry, you're free from some obligations that might hinder you from serving Christ in the fullest way. So it's the same thing he's been saying all along. If you want to get married, that's fine. Not a sin, nothing wrong with it. If you can remain single and remain, pure of body and pure of thought, then you're probably going to spare yourself from some obligations that might hinder you from serving Christ in the fullest way. Now, I want to point a scripture out to you that almost sounds like a contradiction, and I want you to explain to me what it is. So Paul has basically said, good for you not to marry if you can. Like, that would be choice number one, if it works. Now we go over to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. So in 1 Corinthians, we got Paul saying, hey, it's good if you don't marry widows. If you can remain single, good. In 1 Timothy, we've got Paul saying to Timothy, hey, I want the younger widows to get married. What's going on here? So, yeah, that's true. There's even more than that going on. Right. So here's basically the situation. And I pull that verse out of context, and I pull it out of context because that's how people will use it to try to say, well, see, the Bible contradicts itself. But if you go back and you look at the context, Paul is writing to Timothy advice, pastoral advice, because Timothy is sort of functioning as the pastor of the church of Ephesus at the time. And the church at Ephesus was taking it upon themselves the role of providing for widows. So they're creating basically a roll sheet of widows, because in those days, a woman couldn't just go out and get a job. You couldn't just go out and get I'm going down to the steel mill and I'm going to get me a job working, at the foundry or whatever. I mean, it didn't work that way. There were some things you could do, but it was very limited. So when a woman's spouse died, they had no means of support. Now, theoretically, if they had sons, their sons could step in and provide a living for them, and Paul commands them to do that. But what do you do in these situations where a woman's husband dies and she has nobody? Well, the church takes that responsibility, and the church would feed them and provide for their needs. Now, what he's saying is that make sure that these are older widows that really have nobody else. Don't enroll young women, young widows, because here's the thing. They still have a chance to get out and get married, raise a family, be a productive part of society, rather than just sit around their whole life and bum off the church. And that's my paraphrase of what Paul says, but that's basically his meaning that, look, we don't mind enrolling an 80-year-old widow woman and feeding her because she can't do no better. We get it. But if you're 25 and your husband died, it shouldn't be the church's responsibility to feed you for the next 60 years. Go out and do something with your life. That seems to be the idea there. That it should not be the responsibility of the church to shoulder this financial obligation for someone that has other options, other means. Whereas in 1 Corinthians, what he's talking about is a life choice. I'm not asking the church to foot my bill. I'm just choosing to focus on serving the Lord in my singleness until the Lord does something else with me. If the Lord brings somebody else in my life, great. I'm not asking, the church for a handout. I'm just serving the Lord. So that's the difference there. Questions on those verses? All right, I'll give you a couple of little application questions. I struggle trying to come up with names that aren't people in the church, So my names are goofy by design in the hopes that I don't hit anybody here. Margaret is a young lady in your church that sees you as her mentor. And Margaret is engaged to John Bob, who is also a member of your church. And Margaret believes that God is calling her to a career in foreign missions. And John Bob just wants a career managing his father's farm. Now, Margaret has come to you for advice. How are you going to counsel her? I've had this, by the way. It's a hypothetical thing, but the names were changed to protect the innocent, but I've had this situation before. Let them down gently. Okay. Yeah. The problem with that is, for Margaret, it's not a dream, it's a calling. And that's something different than a dream. So, yeah. So, here's what I would say. I would say to Margaret, if she were a member of my church and came to me for advice, if God intends for you and John Bob to be together, then he'll call John Bob to missions as well. And I've had that. I had a guy come to me, this is when we're still in Tennessee, and he said, I believe God is calling me to the ministry. I said, that's great. He said, my wife wants no part of it. I said, well, he said, what should I do? I said, give it time. I said, I said, you are one. I do not believe that God would call one of you to a place of service and not also call the other. So if God is calling you, rest assured He's calling your wife as well. It just may take her a little longer to hear and respond to that call. But rest assured. And I said, at some point, then, you got to follow the call of God. But give it time. Give God time to work before you just up and, I'm moving to Africa and leaving my wife behind. Give God a chance to work. Now, this is a little bit different situation because John, Bob, and Billy Margaret, or whatever her name is, Margaret is not, they're not married, so there's not a marriage vow bond there to be broken. But I would say this to Margaret, and I would say this whether she was dating John, Bob, or anybody. In order to follow the call of God, you must either find someone who shares your call or remain single. I mean, that's it. And Lisa and I had this conversation before we ever got married. When we first started talking about getting married, I'm like, look, this is what God's called me to do. So you better figure out right now if you're called to be a preacher's wife, and if that's something that you're on board with, because if you're not, tell me up front right now, because it ain't gonna work if you ain't. And man, I don't know what all Lisa is or isn't, but I think she made a pretty good preacher's wife out of at the end of the day. But that's what I would say to anybody, is that you have to be on the same page. I talk to couples all the time, and they come in for counseling, and you talk to them a little bit, and I'm like, what I want to say is you're like on totally, and sometimes I do say, like you're on totally opposite page. Like you have no clear direction in your life of what you're doing as a couple, a family, anything. Like you're over here and she's over here, and neither one of you know what in the world you're doing. You're just kind of wandering. You're Forrest Gumping it through life. Wherever the wind blows me, that's where I'm going. Like there's no direction, and it's anyway, that's what I would say. All right, here's the next one. Brother Roy's wife died about a year ago, and he confides in you that he's very lonely and is thinking of dating again. What advice can you give Roy? Don't do it. Yeah. Marry a believer for sure. There you go. And I actually had that down. There is something worse than being lonely, and that's being married to the wrong person. So here's the thing. I would say this. First of all, I get Roy's situation, because I would be Roy. Like I don't do alone. Like I'm not, like Lisa's like when if something happens to you, I don't want to marry again. Like something happens to you, like I'm bringing a date to the funeral. Like I don't do alone. Like that's not my thing. Like I would be the little old man in a one-room apartment with a light bulb hanging down from a extension cord eating a can of Alpo. Like I don't, like alone is not my thing. But I don't even know where I was going with all this. That being said, like I get it. But that being said, you're absolutely right. There is something worse than being alone. So I would say to Roy, if you can find a godly woman, then marry that woman with God's blessing. If you can find a woman crazy enough to have you, then go for it, as long as, But again, like I said before, don't marry anybody that doesn't love Jesus as much as you do. I mean, you want someone that will help your relationship with Christ, not hurt it or harm it. Yes. I'm going to have to come over here. I hear. Lottie Moon followed the call of God and left her love behind. That's a good illustration, yeah. And starved to death in China because she gave her food allotment to the people she was working with. But anyway, so so I gotta tell this story. I'm thinking about old Roy. So we were in Southeast Texas. I won't name the church, although these people are dead by now anyway. But so we had this old man, old woman, like they were in their 80s, like mid 80s, like 85, 86, 87, like he's on supplemental oxygen and walking with a cane, and and she's can't hardly get around and everything. And so they show up one day, and like you kind of saw them like a couple of Sundays, like sitting together in church. You think, oh, that's sweet, that's sweet. And so then one day they come in and they're telling everybody, we got married over the weekend. We got married. And so I went, I asked, I'm like, so y'all got married? Oh, yeah, we got married. I was like, well, it seemed kind of sudden. I mean, I didn't really know y'all were even dating. I didn't realize you were getting married. She said, then the woman, she says, well, we had to get married. I'm like, you had to get married? I said, what do you mean you had to get married? I thought maybe, we get a break on our Social Security tax if we were married. I didn't know, like, she said, oh yeah, well the Bible, now this is the woman telling me this now. The Bible tells us that it's better to get married than to burn with passion, and we just couldn't be around one another without having our hands all over one another, so we just decided to go ahead and get married last weekend. I'm like, oh. Of all of the images in my head that I did not need, that's one of them. So I would say to all the senior adults, if you find the love of your life, I'll do your wedding free of charge. You just tell me where to show up, when and where, but for the love of goodness, please don't give me any details about why you want to get married. I'm not even making you go through premarital counseling. We'll just go sign the license and we'll be done. But anyway. Okay. All right. So, questions, comments on chapter 7. We're going to eventually get out of all this marriage and single stuff. We're going to wind our way into something far less controversial, like speaking in tongues or women covering their heads or something. All right. All right. Well, let's close in a word of prayer. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you Sunday morning. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word, how you do speak to us. Lord, you speak practical things in your word. And God, I pray that you would just, Lord, bless us now as we go to our homes and our families, and I pray that you would just prepare our hearts for Sunday when we'll be back to worship you. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.